So, Phantasy Star Online 2, a game I have a pretty long history with, albeit a very sporadic history. I first played it in the Japanese beta, closed beta, over 11 years ago now. Yeah, I was super into Phantasy Star back then. I played on the Japanese servers at launch, and then one or two more times later down the line. And then I played a very small amount at the English launch. But it never really quite clicked with me until I went back to it last year. And then it finally clicked. Maybe it's just that I liked it more than New Genesis. Maybe it's the fact that this was the time I finally got somewhere with the story. But either way, these days PSO2 is often overshadowed by its shinier, newer relative, New Genesis. Not as many people are playing PSO2 anymore, and I'm kinda disappointed by that because I think it's the better game. So, why do I think that? Well, let's get into it. That's what this whole probably overly long video is about. Starting with the classes and combat, since these are the core of the experience. Classes are primarily oriented around the sets of weapons they use, with little overlap. This ends up creating some issues where there's a second set of classes for each of the three classic Phantasy Star combat styles, but only the melee class gets two full classes with three entirely unique weapons. Ranged and tech characters have to split three weapons between their two classes, which just makes them feel a little less important. Also, there are hybrid classes, though they use completely unique weapons. You're not getting a mix of hunter and ranger weapons, you're getting a new melee weapon and a new ranged weapon. But also there's the glaring lack of a hybrid class that combines ranged weapons and techs. All in all, you can really tell that the classes were added piecemeal over the course of the game's history. And honestly, despite this focus on using weapon selection as a defining feature of each class, there's very little emphasis on using the right weapon for the situation like in older games. Weapons tend to have enough photon arts to cover most situations. Let's do a deep dive on the Scion classes for a moment. They use existing weapons, but have entirely unique movesets for them. They're overwhelmingly powerful, and they have fun and more involved mechanics that make them a great time to play. Unfortunately, they also have a few issues of their own. Namely is that they end up introducing a few of the issues that I feel have become cemented by New Genesis's gameplay. Combat after these were introduced is a bit more detached. You don't feel like you're engaged directly with enemies. Normal enemies are pretty non-threatening, and Scion classes just rip through them like this is a Warriors game. Not to mention, Scion classes' mechanics tend to make it a lot more common to just float in the air and spam attacks more like it's New Genesis. In base PSO2, you would otherwise spend a lot more time, on the ground. Even fighting bosses, this doesn't really change. It mostly ends up feeling like you're fighting at them rather than with them, if that makes any sense. What they do has very little impact on you besides maybe if you want to dodge. You're not moving around for positioning or anything, you're just spamming your attacks at them and occasionally doing whatever it is you do to defend. And unfortunately, there are some issues with them even within the game itself, such as that, like the base class selection, the selection of Scion classes also feels a little incomplete and underdeveloped. The first two Scion classes are Jack of all trades, with one melee, one ranged, and one tech weapon each, making them play a lot like the original PSO in a sense. Then you have a purely melee class with a side of support, mostly doing its own thing. And lastly, you have a class that focuses solely on the gunblade, a weapon every other class can use, and instead of having different weapons, it has three different stances based on your weapon element. The Scion classes all feel very different in a way that makes me wish there were more of them and the game were designed around them. After all, they were only really added in the last 2 episodes. Honestly, I kinda wish NGS had done something like that, really make the Scion classes the focus. But all that complaining aside, I have infinitely more fun playing Phantom in PSO2 than anything in New Genesis. I enjoy the greater mechanical complexity and the variation created by having 3 completely distinct weapon types. Having to rely on the sidestep dodge for defense forces me to be a lot more mobile. Plus, this just suits my style. Phantom uses some of my favorite weapon types, with katanas, rifles, and rods all being ones I'm fond of. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that New Genesis should get some form of Scion classes, since they already missed out on building the game around them. I mean, it already took some ideas from them, so why not go all the way with this? What I'm really asking is this. Come on, Sega, give me Phantom, you motherfucker. For the most part, the combat in PSO2 is the same as NGS, though it does feel a bit better. While the movement is stiffer, combat never feels as repetitive and spammy. And without the extreme mobility that characters in New Genesis have, combat feels more restrained and focused. Additionally, I just really like that using items takes time and has an animation. It makes things a little more thoughtful and helps to ensure that Resta is really valuable as a faster group heal option. Everything honestly just feels a little more thought out. It might not be a top-tier action game, but it still feels more impactful than New Genesis. That said, it is quite fast-paced, and I don't mean that in the best of ways. Even before Scion classes, there just isn't much room or need for a more complicated or strategic approach to combat. It's more deliberate than combat in New Genesis, but that isn't saying much. At least there's the just attack system, which forces you to time your inputs instead of just mashing. This slows things down, and without it, New Genesis ends up just feeling like a button masher. And granted, this is all from the perspective of someone who likes his combat deliberate and impactful. I prefer more technical or thoughtful combat to spectacle or power fantasy. So while it's fun enough, and I like it a lot more than combat in New Genesis, I ultimately feel like this combat is just okay, and it's not good enough to justify the game focusing much more on action combat and much less on compelling RPG mechanics. So that's the action side of this action RPG, but what about the second half of that genre name? And in particular, what about the loot and the grinding, 2 of the pillars of this series? Well, the approach to grind and loot are also very different from NGS, in a way that definitely will appeal to most older fans more. Loot in PSO2 is much more about getting the rare gear than upgrading it, and I frankly prefer this. I was never the biggest fan of how NGS focuses on spending so much time grinding for marginal improvements to your equipment over and over. Also worth knowing is that this game has rare armor, and that the armor units show up on your character, which I really like. It makes armor feel more important. It really doesn't feel interesting in New Genesis. And while it's not as focused on upgrading as New Genesis is, there are still some deeper upgrading systems in the late game. Admittedly, I never really have gotten to grips with them, so they're pretty much mostly there for endgame stuff. Probably the best thing I can say about the equipment system is that at least there's still the random elements on gear. The element system is one of the last vestiges of the older games' focus on switching equipments. The experience grind is also paced a bit differently. Notably, the experience curve is much sharper, with the cost of leveling up increasing dramatically after a certain point. But Because stat gain slowed down after a certain point, leveling to 100 only really gives you skill points, access to a few high-level things, and bragging rights. While New Genesis feels like it expects everyone to hit the cap before they even really get sunk into the game, it feels as if that is not the case with PSO2. All this said, I do generally prefer PSO2's approach to grinding, as it just feels much more about the journey rather than constantly rushing to endgame. Helping this is the much wider difficulty selections for many urgent quests, and the fact that, much like the older games, there's an emphasis on climbing to new difficulty tiers. It just feels like the content is more evenly distributed instead of only being focused at endgame. Maybe if you're mostly concerned about the endgame as the important stuff, this won't matter and might even be a downside to PSO2. But if you like to take your time and enjoy the journey, I feel like PSO2 has a lot more to offer there. Also, while I'm on the RPG elements, the skill system is a highlight. While many of the RPG mechanics in this game are a bit simple, even compared to the previous titles, the skill system here stands out. It was introduced here, and while sadly New Genesis mostly chose to simplify it, this does mean that PSO2 stands out in the series. Every class has a wide selection of passives, from stat boosts to core mechanics to dramatic changes in gameplay style. And unlike New Genesis, most skills have many levels to upgrade through, creating a better balance when making trade-offs when planning your build. Now as for the story, this is one of PSO2's strong points, especially compared to New Genesis. It's really one of the main things that kept me invested. Though that said, episode 1 is a pretty slow burn, and it's greatly hurt by the change in presentation, which I'll touch on a little more later. Because episode 1 spends so much time establishing the large ensemble cast, it's admittedly a bit tedious until the end, where things finally start to pick up and things start happening in a way that actually feels connected. Then following that are episodes 2 and 3, which are really just excellent and the high points of the game. There's several twists and unexpected and novel story arcs, all building up to this grandiose conclusion. If the game had stopped there, it honestly might have been for the best. But the show must go on. At least because the show did go on, there was still a game around for me to play these amazing first 3 episodes. Unfortunately, the fact that the story is seemingly meant to come to an end here led to some real problems with continuing. Episodes 4 and 5 don't just feel like they weren't quite sure how to continue things, but they feel generic. Like a watering down of Phantasy Star to make something to appeal to as many people as possible, and both do so by transporting you to entirely new dimensions that are pretty detached from the science fantasy adventure setting that by this point you will have grown quite accustomed to. Episode 4 has you transported to a near future Earth, and you get caught up in a plot there. Midway through, there are some ties given back to PSO2's actual story, but those are brushed aside by the end to focus things back entirely on Earth's plot. It's the only story where you feel like a bystander. The rest of the game actually does a surprisingly good job of balancing your being a silent hero with still letting you feel like a main character. Chapter 5, meanwhile, takes you to a fantasy world where almost everyone is somehow an alternate version of characters from PSO2, or in a couple of admittedly nice cases, classic Phantasy Star. It's a lot better due to the fact that the action is ultimately still driven by the Dark Falls and Profound Darkness, so while it is out there, it does still feel like an extension of the PSO2 plot. Honestly, my biggest complaint with it is the relatively generic fantasy setting and the painfully generic fantasy monsters. Episode 6 is a bit cleverer in how it continues on from episode 5 at least. I don't want to spoil it, but you'll probably have an "oh, that explains it" moment or two when you start getting into the episode 6 plot. It's also just made more fun by being the last episode. In episodes 4 and 5, I wound up getting a bit over-leveled or overpowered, but that's less of a problem here since the hardcore versions of missions already assume you're running up against the game's final level cap, or at least getting close to it. That said, there is an issue with some of the side stories being shown out of the order, weirdly. And of course, the biggest benefit of this is that this is finally fully focused back on Phantasy Star Online 2's plot for the first time in the back half of this game's 6 episodes. And I think it makes for a pretty good finale, although not as good as episode 3 was. Honestly, I think it just focuses a little too much on the villains, which are not especially interesting. Overall, I would only really feel comfortable staking my reputation on endorsing the first half of PSO2's episodes 1, 2, and 3. The second half does get good eventually, but you have to wade through a lot of bad to get there. It's there if you want more PSO2, but I'm not sure I would have stuck it out, especially through Chapter 4, if I wasn't planning on doing this video. In fact, it's what killed my momentum playing through base PSO2 last year. I was just so bored going through the early parts of Episode 4. But if I may say one more thing about the story as a whole, I will say that one of my favorite parts is how many different characters there are and how it feels like they all have their own adventures going on. It really helps the world feel more alive in a way that I think is really important for a game that, by design, has you as not being the only hero. NPCs aren't just their own characters, but they help to serve as stand-ins for your friends and other players, showing that there are things for ARC's members to do who aren't you currently saving the world. And also, unlike the side stories in New Genesis, these weren't a later addition. They were always in the game, and so the game always felt a bit more complete. All that said, while I am mostly pretty positive on the game, I feel like there are some flaws I have to go over. Though honestly, many of these are just down to the fact that the game is clearly in its end-of-life maintenance mode. If you've played any online RPG that's 10 years or so old, you'll know there's just a sort of funkiness that builds up over having so many updates piled on top of the base game. First issue, there's some population problems, though obviously that's not really something SEGA has control over, although maybe they could do a little more to incentivize people to play this. They don't really seem to care. There's also the fact that the game has so many mechanics going on in places that it's a bit overwhelming, especially with the many different currencies, weapon upgrades, and crafting mechanics. Sometimes this can be fun, giving you multiple different projects to work on, but other times it's just confusing and overwhelming. Also, over the course of the updates, the story mode has been overly streamlined. You see, originally in the early episodes, story progress was slow and organic. You'd progress it through accomplishing tasks on your divergence matrix, basically a board of assorted tasks to do in the game, and you'd often encounter NPCs out in the wilderness while running through areas. Maybe it was a bit too slow, but it had its charms. And it also helps to explain why there were so many side scenes in the early episodes and why the pacing is so slow in these parts. Not to mention that it just kind of worked with the themes of attempting to change the course of events away from a predicted path. But these days, it's a whole lot of scenes, many of which are mostly small character moments that you play by clicking on them in a menu. It's very inorganic and repetitive. And also, while there are some occasional minor updates to PSO2 these days, there is very little support for it. For instance, there's no advancing the mission pass to unlock cosmetics in PSO2. You have to play New Genesis for that. Even the 11th anniversary event was entirely confined to New Genesis. I wish they'd used it as a chance to encourage players to play both games. Instead, it honestly feels like they're only keeping base PSO2 around out of obligation and want as many people as possible to switch to New Genesis. As I sort of mentioned earlier, loot is pretty unremarkable. Most of the later stuff is organized into sets that take all the uniqueness out of the rare items. And even before that, the gear tends to have very little mechanical differentiation beyond raw power. Unfortunately, reducing gear to just pure power is a trend throughout the series, which is unfortunate, but this is to be expected. But PSO2 and New Genesis do both have it the worst. Status effects are pretty useless, being a purely random chance that barely even matters when most enemies won't survive long enough for one to trigger. And most of the other random abilities on gear, those are mostly just stat boosts that most of the time you'll just want to be offense boosts. About the only thing that does help differentiate gear and encourage switching is the elements, which I'm glad are still here to give you some incentive to switch in combat to use what's best. The way that New Genesis reduced elements to just being features of specific weapon series was another disappointment there. And the last big thing is just that the game often feels like it leans a little too much on being an action game rather than an RPG. This was the unfortunate inevitability with the direction of the industry at the time. Action RPGs were trending towards being much more action than RPG because I'm not sure anyone really understood how the RPG elements made things better. And frankly, PSO2 seems more interested in being a Devil May Cry wannabe than doing what made Phantasy Star great. But it doesn't nearly rise to the heights of Devil May Cry, so instead it's just a mid-tier action game with some RPG components being honestly mostly in the way. At least the skill trees are compelling. New Genesis can't even claim that. But a lot of the RPG elements end up just boiling down to stacking more and more offensive power. Mags are hit especially hard here. The classic little support robots are back from the original PSO, but without that game's focus on your character's stats, with being able to switch mags being great for switching builds on the fly, mags end up just being here to boost your attack power. Scion classes even give you skills that let you boost one stat on your mag and turn that into a boost for all of your offensive stats. So you can't even have multiple mags and swap between them to adjust to best suit your current weapon. As that sort of indicates, this is kind of where the series was starting to lose sight of what really made it special. So while skill trees and weapon actions are great additions that I think could have worked in any of the classic games, they end up just being kind of fun ideas in a kind of underwhelming Phantasy Star experience, if I'm honest. But after all this negativity, I want to focus on one more big positive on PSO2 over New Genesis, which is just all the little details. New Genesis might have its grand open world, but so much of the game just feels lifeless. Honestly, at its worst, New Genesis feels like it's been designed by committee. Base PSO2 is a much more focused experience. It doesn't have the big marketable feature of the open world, but instead it feels much more focused on making every part feel good. And I do mean every part. I think the best example of PSO2's attention to detail and passion is in the UI. The UI in New Genesis is pretty bland. I don't know, I get this minimalist look is in these days, but I always thought this was so unremarkable and boring. Meanwhile, look at the UI in PSO2 and all the personality this has. Hell, just look at the animations on these icons. They didn't have to do this, but they did, and the game is richer for it. So I guess that brings us to sort of the conclusion, which is that PSO2 has an intentionality to its design that New Genesis simply doesn't. But then again, there's also a fundamentally different design philosophy behind them. I don't think I was ever going to like New Genesis as much because New Genesis is targeting a completely separate audience, while base PSO2 is still carrying the vestiges of the previous games. New Genesis wants to be a more socially focused game, with the action RPG elements streamlined and downplayed, turned into a more broadly appealing but maybe a bit flavorless base to support selling cosmetics for its robust character customization. But PSO2 is still mostly aimed to be the next big Phantasy Star game. Heck, maybe if it was a bit better and wasn't Japan only for 10 years, maybe it could have even gone and become a staple of the online gaming world like the original was. But yes, well, maybe my point got a bit lost in comparing PSO2 to the older games. I think base PSO2 is still worth playing. I mean, the title kinda gives that away, huh? Although sadly, it's not as popular as New Genesis and doesn't get as much support, which is a real shame when I think it's the superior experience. But even if it's not as well loved, I'm glad that the current arrangement means that it gets to continue on, and I'm glad it's finally available in the West. I wish I had been able to get into it earlier, but, well, it wasn't meant to be. I really do think it's worth checking out, especially if you're already playing New Genesis. If there's one thing I would really like to see for base PSO2, I wish that they'd implement progression servers. I understand that's how they did things when the game finally released in the West, recreating the way the game released in Japan at a much faster pace. I feel like a lot of issues I have are just down to the game feeling like an online RPG at the end of its life. You know, a wonky progression curve, too many systems, depreciated content, and a lack of any real way to meet people unless you're a super endgame. Additionally, while I definitely enjoy PSO2, I do kinda hate the era it's created for the franchise. I don't like that because it was Japan only for so long that we went nearly 10 years without any new Phantasy Star Online content in the West. It's something even more jarring since in those 10 years it became a lot less common to see games in general that never leave Japan, especially from anything resembling a big franchise. I also don't like that it moved the series from being more of a multiplayer action RPG into more of an MMO, and that now we have to put up with daily tasks and other manipulative shit. And I also don't like that we don't get as many games in the franchise as we used to. It varies depending on how you slice it, granted, but look, I just miss the day when we had more variety in Phantasy Star titles to enjoy. Moving to an MMO-style constant update model is, honestly in my eyes, detrimental. But that's mostly a symptom of the environment games are in right now. I really do miss the older Phantasy Star titles, but hey, we can still go back to them. It's going to be a long-term project, but from here on I'm going to work on a retrospective series on Phantasy Star Online. Because while I like PSO2, I love the older games. Most of my criticism ends up coming from comparing it to those titles. And come to think of it, most of my compliments for PSO2 come from comparing it to New Genesis. But if we want to see what made this series special, we have to go back. All the way back to the beginning to see what made the original Phantasy Star Online so classic. But for now, this is MacLeod signing off.